I'd like to speak to you this morning, if I may, about ripples and waves and the power that each and every one of us has to be agents for change. What is a ripple? Well, I'd like to think of a ripple as much more than the effect that's produced by throwing a stone into water. I see a ripple as an act, a situation, a sentiment, or an event that has far-reaching consequences, far, far beyond its immediate location in space and time. I see it as the concept that refers to every action having a reaction or consequence. This concept is used often in sociology, in economics, and in many other fields to refer to an occurrence, a behaviour, a thing that can have an effect on many other things, intended or unintended. So with that in mind, I would like to share with you briefly my story. I am, like many of you here today, a first-generation Australian. I am a migrant's kid. I am the product of an Indian Muslim father and an Anglo-Saxon Australian mother. We came to these shores in the late 1970s from India. And indeed, when arriving as newcomers to this land, it had all the promise of being the lucky country. But it was difficult, it was challenging as an outsider to assimilate in what was, apart from my Indigenous brothers and sisters, a very white Australia in those conservative times. I remember experiencing firsthand the challenges and the prejudice that my father, a dark-skinned Muslim immigrant, experienced in 1970s Australia. I also remember feeling very powerless and voiceless at the age of 9, having been sexually abused by a trusted neighbour and friend. And as a result of these two significant events in my life, as a young woman, I decided to dedicate my career to helping others find a voice, to helping others access justice. To do that, I decided on a career in the law. I was, however, a very insecure little girl as a result of these early experiences. And my maternal grandmother used to tell a story that at the age of 7, I developed an alter ego for myself. Her name was Caroline Jones. And Caroline was blonde-haired, she was blue-eyed, she was a Catholic. I'm not quite sure why she was a Catholic. I think it's because most of my mates at school were Catholic. But most importantly, Caroline ate ham sandwiches for lunch. And ladies and gentlemen, you don't know how important that was for me, because I was the only kid at school that wasn't packed with ham sandwiches in their lunchbox. No, I was one of those kids that had the smelly curry sandwiches that I got good at dumping on the way to school. I guess this story is a reflection of the fact that I resented my differences. I resented being a different race, being a different religion, having a different name, and even sounding differently, because I came to this country with a British accent. But having made the decision as a young adult to dedicate my career and my life to helping others, I started my career here in Perth as a lawyer. Don't hold that against me. But eventually in the late 1990s, I left Australia for the United Kingdom because I had this dream that had become an obsession. I wanted to practice as an international humanitarian lawyer. And after leaving for the UK in a coincidental accident, you might say, where I was exposed to the British military for the first time, whilst on expedition to South America, I decided to commission as a legal officer in the British Army, as a way I hoped that I would be able to access places and people that were suffering in silence for so long. People who lived in parts of the world where human rights, equal rights, and justice were foreign concepts. And so I decided on this career in the British Army. I didn't think when I put my application in that I would stand a chance. What on earth would the British Army want with a foreign, female, Muslim lawyer with absolutely no military exposure? So I threw the application in and forgot. That wasn't until 7 weeks later when I got the fright of my life and I got a call from the head of the Army Legal Services asking me to front up for a selection panel. Amazingly, I was selected to commission, and I will never forget the day when I found out. As soon as I put the phone down to the Army, I rang up my parents here in Perth. My father answered the phone, and I'll never forget, I was so excited, and I said, Dad, you'll never guess what? They've chosen me. I've been commissioned as an officer in the British Army. And I will never, ever forget to this day my dad's concerning, sensitive, tender words in his response. He said something like this, Rabia, don't be so bloody stupid. And for the Indians and Asians in the audience, you will know that the translation of that is, my darling, I'm concerned. Have you thought about this? This seems rather rash. Could you take me through your thinking? So following this response, I decided that it was probably a good idea to take a quick trip home, sit down with my parents and explain to them face to face why I had decided to take this seemingly barking mad decision. I had 5 days between finishing off my job as a lawyer in the south of England and starting my officer military training at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst in England. So, as a young woman, footloose and fancy-free, I thought 5 days, a day there, a day back, 3 days in Perth, yeah, can do. So I decided on this lightning trip. The day that I was due to board my flight bound for Perth was the 11th of September 2001. A day that I'm sure each and every one of you will remember exactly where you were and what you were doing on that fateful and devastating day. For me, I was sitting in a London Heathrow Airport departure lounge, and I was looking up at a screen that usually had departure and arrival information that had been switched to the news. And I was watching the second tower fall. And two things struck me in the moments after watching the second tower fall. The first was this overwhelming feeling in the pit of my stomach that our world as we knew it was about to change in ways that we couldn't conceive. The second was more of an observation, because you see, in my departure lounge, there were a number of flights bound for the Middle East, and therefore there were a number of Islamic Middle Eastern people waiting to board their flights in traditional Islamic attire. And as I looked at these people, I noticed that they were getting frisked. They were getting manhandled, and they were getting jeered and abused by fellow travellers as well as airport officials. And I thought that that was alarming, because this was happening moments before the words Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were even mentioned on the news reports. But at that point in time, it wasn't personal, because you see, I had spent my whole life distancing myself from whence I had come. I went back home, and by the time I came back 4 days later to the UK, I was more resolved than ever that I had to continue down this unexpected path that I had set. I felt that I had somehow been guided down this path, and that this was now my intended journey, come what may. 3 years into my military career, I received the second most unexpected call of my life, this time again from my commander. He advised me that I had been selected to deploy to Iraq as one of the first legal advisors with the United Kingdom Brigade on what we called Operation Telic, and that I was to spend the best part of a year in 2005 in Iraq. Before I deployed, I had a realization. I was about to spend a year in this Islamic war-torn country as an uninvited guest, and I was a Muslim woman with a recognizable Muslim name. I had a responsibility to get back in touch with whence I had come. So I learnt Arabic, and I read about the teachings of the Quran. And when I deployed to Iraq, already a square peg in a round hole, I decided that I was going to do things differently, that I was going to do my job with empathy, with respect, and with humanity. After all, that was what I had dedicated my life to. And so, when I would meet with my Iraqi colleagues to help them re-establish law and order in their country that had been left in a vacuum of chaos and distress after the overthrowing of Saddam's regime, I would start every meeting by speaking a little bit of Arabic. Poorly, but enough to break the ice. I would wear a hijab or headscarf. I wonder what Mr. Abbott would think about that. Not as a sign of subjugation, but as a mark of respect. And my approach was to ask these people what they needed, what their priorities were, and how I could have the honour of helping them. Not to tell them what was required and how they could help me. So I guess by having this different, what we would, I'm sure, call common sense, respectful approach, I was able to gain good relationships with my Iraqi colleagues. So fast forward 6 months into my deployment, the 19th of September 2005, when 2 of my British Special Forces colleagues had been kidnapped, detained and taken to an infamous police compound called the Al Jamiat. The Al Jamiat was actually the home of a terrorist group called the Jaish al-Mahdi. When we heard news that the 2 men had been taken to Al Jamiat, we knew that that was not good. My colleague of equal rank, a chap by the name of Major James Woodham, was deployed in to conduct a reconnaissance mission, a recce, and to see if he could negotiate for their release. But within half an hour of James deploying in, he sent word back that the Iraqis, the terrorists, the government in Iraq would not speak to him. The only person that they would negotiate with was Major Rabia, as they called me. And I guess that's because by that stage I had established myself as a person of my word, a person with some humanity and integrity. So I was ordered in, despite being a mere legal officer with no hostage negotiation training and no close hand-to-hand combat. I was ordered in to lead the negotiations, and it was clear that despite my misgivings, I was these 2 men' only hope. As we hovered over the compound, I saw a sight that I wasn't prepared for. Hundreds of Iraqis had gathered around the compound, and I could hear the crackle of gunfire as the chopper came in. We landed nearby, I jostled my way through the crowd and was ushered into an office where I immediately began negotiating with the Iraqi government representative. Eventually, I secured their agreement to go to the cell so I could see these 2 men, because I wanted to ascertain whether they were alive and well, whether they were who we believed they were. I wasn't going to let James go, who had now become the passive observer in this event. He was my only friend, so he was coming with me like it or not. And ladies and gentlemen, it's about now that I need to confess that, encouraged by this achievement, encouraged by the fact that it had been agreed that I could see these men, adrenaline pumping, blood coursing through my veins, I am pretty cocky. And we bound through the cell, and I see the 2 men in the corner, and I order that their hoods and their chains be removed. And in this pumped up state where I temporarily lost control of my senses, I don't know, I thought perhaps I was Lara Croft at the time. The hoods were removed, and I'll never forget uttering the words that I will regret till this very day. Something like this. "It's all right, guys," I said. "I've come to say ya." Yeah. And you know, the Brits, they're a polite bunch, aren't they? And these 2 chaps were no exception, and they gave me a wry smile. I knew on reflection what they were thinking was, oh my goodness. I'm dulling it down for polite company. If this is the best the British Army can do, we're finished. Anyway, I eventually got control of my senses again and recommenced negotiations. And I kid you not, just as we were about to sign a negotiation agreement upon which the men would be released into my custody, all hell broke loose outside. The crowd outside had swollen to some 3,000 in number. They had set the British soldiers that were trying to control them and protect us, they'd set them alight. And they stormed the compound, and within moments everything changed. James and I were thrown into another cell, and we 2 became hostages for many, many more hours. And during those hours, as the only woman, as the only Arabic speaker in the room, I was subjected to some degrading and humiliating treatment. I also faced my, I suppose, moment of death when a man came in from outside brandishing an AK-47. He cocked it and he pointed it in between my eyes. And all I could do was look at him and challenge his humanity. And that single act of defiance must have had some effect, not on him, but on the man next to him, who wrestled him to the ground, took his weapon off him and threw him out of the cell. And that man was the commanding officer of the terrorist group. A number of hours later, we were miraculously rescued, and that should have been the end of my story, but it wasn't. We went back to headquarters. James received a hero's welcome and was sent in for military debriefing. I received a cup of tea, a kiss on the cheek, and I was ordered back to my tent. No debriefing, no acknowledgement of a job well done, and the silence in relation to my role on that day was deafening. And I felt gobsmacked, and I felt abandoned, and I felt betrayed. But I soldiered on because I had made promises to the Iraqis. But by the time I returned from Iraq to the UK almost a year later, I was broken. And 2006 was my annus horribilis. It started with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. I was then diagnosed after suffering with ill health from a very rare ectopic pregnancy, which almost cost me my life. And as I was convalescing, I got news that James had been awarded a military cross, and I received an order never to speak of my involvement again. And as I returned to work after my ectopic pregnancy, my husband was diagnosed with cancer. And then the nail in the coffin. My friend, my colleague in Iraq who had worked on human rights abuses with me, a man by the name of Asaf al-Nahi, had been murdered, leaving behind a lovely young family. Murdered as a result of the work he was doing with me. And I felt guilty. And I felt like I had his blood on my hands. And I didn't know how I could go on. But I had to go on. Because I had made promises to all of those that were voiceless and powerless. But I realized before I could go on and help others, I had to help myself. And so I got treatment. Treatment that allowed me to regain my inner strength and to heal. Treatment that allowed me eventually, after exhausting all other informal avenues, seek my justice in what became a landmark discrimination case against the British government and the British military. And I won my case. Thank you. But ladies and gentlemen, the win was not the important thing for me. It was the effect afterwards. I received thousands of messages from people all over the world, and the message was the same. Rabia, if you can take on the might of the British military, the British government, and win, then surely we can take a stand in our homes, in our workplaces, in our communities. And that's when it struck me. I, one person, had been able to create ripples that became waves. As a consequence of my actions, a sequence of events was set in course that ultimately changed the policies and the attitudes towards women and Muslims in the British forces. And I was just one person. Just one person. You know, there are many, many people in history and in our world that through their actions as one person have created ripples and waves. Those that have strove for equality and peace, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Aung San Suu Kyi, the Dalai Lama, to name but a few. There are those in the world whose act has changed our lives. Thomas Newcomen, the inventor of the steam engine. Thomas Edison, the inventor of the electric light bulb. Professor Leonard Kleinrock, the person who sent the first message over the internet. And closer to home, David Warren, the inventor of the black box flight recorder. And Doctors Lidwell and Booth, the inventors of the electronic pacemaker. And thousands, countless of other unnamed and unrecognised volunteers that dedicate their life to helping the vulnerable, the disenfranchised and the voiceless. To name but a few. We all have the power to create ripples. We all have the power to create ripples. And so, I would like, my friends, having shared this story with you, to leave you with some messages. In this world, we need more than ever to come together and create ripples and waves, to mobilize ourselves and others for a greater good and a higher purpose. We can do this by sharing our stories, as I have shared with you today, by upholding and defending our values that we ought to hold dear. From time to time, we need to take our head out of our smartphones. We need to look up, and we need to open our eyes, our ears, and our hearts. And so I leave you with this call to action, my friends. Mother Teresa said, "I cannot change the world alone, but I can cast a stone across the waters and create many ripples." I ask you to do the same. Join with me. Create ripples and waves. And if you have any doubt, in the words of Emma Watson, who delivered her speech recently to the United Nations launching the He for She campaign, she said, ask yourself 2 questions. I say ask yourself 3 questions. Does it matter? If not me, then whom? If not now, then when? Mahatma Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in this world. I ask you all, please be the change you wish to see in this world, and join me by creating ripples and waves. Thank you.